Okay, so all right, so thanks for the opening, Valerie. All right, so today is the second workshop in the building websites with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript series. So just to kick our workshop today, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping and start with a very brief introduction of myself again. All right, so for those who missed out our previous workshop, my name is Eric. I'm the assigned instructor for this series of workshops, namely the building websites with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, deploying web applications, and programming with databases. This workshop is scheduled for 2 hours, but given the nature of the topic, it might not stretch fully into the 2 hours, probably like 1 hour 45 or 1 hour 50 minutes or so. And if you followed our last workshop, there are no additional applications that you need to download. So apart from the Visual Studio Code that we talked about in the previous workshop, so if you already have the application installed and got it all working, everything is good, all right? So if you haven't, you probably want to look into downloading Visual Studio Code from this website here. Okay, I'm gonna share it on Zoom chat. Okay, so we have a lot to cover today, so let's jump right in. So to get our workshop started for today, I want you guys to open up your development environment, right? So usually when I say, hey, open up your development environment, usually I'm referring to, hey, you have to go back to your previous project folder and then open up Visual Studio Code, get everything set up so that you can straight away and go in and start writing code. So I'm going to show the whole process again because I did this once in the last workshop. You guys probably are not familiar with those steps yet, so I'm just going to do this again on my side. Okay, so what you guys want to do is basically just launch your Visual Studio Code, regardless of which platform you're on. Okay. So depending on how you last closed your Visual Studio Code, your screen might look a little bit different. So for example, over here, I basically closed everything. So this is my welcome screen, my getting started screen. If you opened your project before, you should be able to see one of the options over here. For example, last workshop, we basically stopped at in this folder over here, Build on ASEAN 2021. Okay, but if you don't have that, you probably have to create a folder, or you know that you have a folder somewhere. You probably want to click on File, click on Open, and navigate through the folder that you're referring to. Okay, so obviously, depending on whether you're on Windows or Mac, the what's it called, navigation bar over here might look a little bit different. Okay, but the keywords are roughly the same. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I can click here, but obviously I want to go around and show you the proper steps. Let me click on File, click on Open, and navigate to your folder. All right. So last workshop I mentioned something about putting all my projects into the code folder. So that's where I'm going to and look for Build on ASEAN 2021. Okay. Now this is how I name my folder. Okay, my project for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Depending on how you named it, you probably have to look for a different folder. So I'm going to click on Open and do a little bit of verification again. If you click on the Explorer tab, you should see the name of your folder. Okay, Build on ASEAN 2021. That's the folder that I'm supposed to be working on, and also that I'm going to work on for today's workshop. Okay. All right, so in our last workshop, we basically covered the basics of HTML. As you can see, we basically left it as this, right? We stopped at how we create forms, and then we basically covered things like tags, attributes, H1 to H6, how do you create lists and all that, okay? So in today's workshop, we're going to look at CSS and its role in the context of a web page. So usually when you're dealing with documents, right? Last time I used to talk about there's PDF documents and then there's Microsoft Word documents. When you're dealing with documents like this, we are usually just facing one single file, right? If we transfer this file to another computer, they basically can access the whole document. But in the context of a web page, they're basically like a tree of files, okay? Really depending on whether this HTML file is sort of linked to any other files that's required for this thing to work in its full potential. So in this case, it's exactly the same. When you're looking at a web page, right? When you load, for example, this web page over here, you will first load the HTML. Then the HTML describes the other files, the rest of the files that this HTML file needs. Then only the browser will go and fetch the rest of the files. But the very first file that the browser gets is always the HTML file. Chaitanya, your VS is 2017 version. Be sure that you're not referring to Visual Studio, okay? Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio is very different. Visual Studio is another application where I think you used to code C++, okay? It's a very different application. Please make sure it's Visual Studio Code. Right. All right, so today we're going to look at CSS. CSS also stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It's a separate language that allows us to control the appearance of our HTML file. Okay, it's often described as a way for us to sort of like style and present our content inside our HTML document. If I were to put it into an analogy, HTML is like a house, okay? And CSS is like this interior designer that's responsible arranging all the furniture, painting the walls and all the jazz, right? In order to do so, we usually need to create a separate file in your project folder, and that file ends with the CSS file extension, right? So for example, over here, I already have an index.html and page2.html. Now, if I were to create a CSS file for this web page, which is only for index.html, I will have to come down here and create a new file. So I'm going to go through like creating a new process of creating a new file over here. Either you right click, there's a context menu where you can look for new file, or you can straight away click on this icon over here, the one that looks like a paper and a plus sign on it, right? So I'm going to click on the plus sign over here. And I'm going to create a file called styles.css, okay? And press enter. Don't worry about the icon over here showing 3 on my screen, and then your site is not showing as 3 or whatever. Don't worry about that. That's just an extra extension that I installed to make my code editor looks nicer, okay? As you can see, last week, last workshop, I basically talked about how you must name your landing page as index.html. But what about styles.css? Do I have to write it as styles? Do I have to name it as styles.css? You don't have to, okay? There's no strict requirements to this, but styles.css is a pretty common name. There's another more common name, it's called style.css. Really depends on whether it's plural or singular. For me, it doesn't really matter. So, because why? I'll show you why this matters. The name of this file doesn't matter. What matters the most is you must have the file extension at the end, .css, okay? That is what sort of like tells the computer, tells the code editor that this is a CSS file. And VS Code has all sorts of like interesting feature that works with CSS right out of the box. So in order for us to remember, just now I talked about how the browsers get the HTML first, then the HTML tells the browser, hey, I actually need a couple more files, right? So in order for us to do that, we actually have to add this line into our HTML so that it loads the correct CSS file that you just created here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to index.html, okay? And we're going to actually write a line to link this particular CSS into the file. So in order to do so, I would have to go to, remember the head tag, okay? The order doesn't matter. You put it at the top, you can put it at the end, doesn't really matter. So long as it is inside the head tag, all right? So I'm gonna put it right here, and I'm going to write link : CSS and press tab, okay? Again, link : CSS and press tab. The reason why I'm not asking you to write the whole thing manually because as you can see, it is quite long, okay? You have to write the link tag, obviously, there's no closing tag, and 2 attributes, right? One is rel, one is href. What is rel, what is href? Rel is basically It's trying to say, hey, this file that I'm trying to link, what is this file's relation to this HTML file? So you are supposed to use some of the predefined keywords. You're not supposed to write an essay about, hey, my sister wrote this CSS for me, right? So I thought it's really nice. I'm going to import it here, blah, blah, blah. No, okay. You need to write using a couple of predefined keywords. One of them is style sheet over here. href, last workshop, I basically talked about href over here as well in the anchor tag. href stands for hyperlink reference. This is where you need to sort of like point to the CSS file that you're trying to import, right? Link it to, sorry, okay? And over here, as you can see, this is wrong, because why? I name my file styles of CSS. So you've got two choices here. Either you rename your file to style.css, or you just rename this line to styles.css. Okay, either way works. As you can see, this is why I don't really care what my CSS file is named. Okay, I can name it style.css, I can name it a.css, doesn't really matter. So long you can write it over here and refer to the correct file with a correct name. Okay, that's all that matters. So I'm going to save this thing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually launch up the whole development environment. I want to see my web browser loading my web page, right? So that I can make my code, write my code, and then it loads up automatically. On the bottom right corner, you can see there's a go live button. If you don't see it, either you restart your VS Code or you make sure that you have your extension live server. Okay, make sure you have this extension. All right. If you already installed this and you don't see it, most likely you have to restart your VS Code. That's all. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the go live button. Click on this, and it should start up my server and my Google Chrome. What other extensions do you need? Honestly, it's like window shopping. You just shop for whatever extensions that you feel like, hey, this could be useful. It helps with my development flow, right? So you just have to shop for it. Some of the a couple of examples is probably prettier, right? Auto formats a code, but we're not going to look into that for now. Okay. As you can see, I managed to load up my HTML page, and obviously nothing has changed. It is exactly the same as how I left the web page since the last workshop. Obviously, that's the case because I've linked my CSS. I'm not even sure if I linked it correctly, right? If I look at my CSS file, it's empty, right? So even if I linked it wrongly, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't have known. So the fastest way for us to test this thing out is to at least write a bit of CSS code so that you can see whether this thing is working or not. So CSS code actually looks nothing like HTML code. As you can see, HTML code looks like this. There's like an opening tag, and then there's a closing tag, and attributes and all that. CSS is not like this. CSS is all about declaring styles in the form of property values, right? If you remember your dictionary in Python, they have key value pairs, right? It's almost exactly the same in CSS. There's a key being the rule, and the value being the value, obviously, that you want to set the rule to. All right. So I'm going to write a very simple sample CSS code. Don't worry if you are like, oh, I don't know what this means. I'm going to go right in and explain what this CSS code means. So I'm going to write this. If you can follow, please try to copy whatever I'm writing over here to see if it works. All right, that's it. Okay, I'm going to leave it as that. So there is a body, all right, which is a single, just a single word, no string, no nothing. You don't need to wrap it with double quotation or single quotation mark. Put your curly brackets, and inside the curly brackets, you should have something like this, which is your key value pair, right? Which should be familiar to you guys if you guys have gone through Mr. Wawai's beginning Python series. Right, so color red, right? So something is going to go red. I'm not sure what. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit save. Okay, so as you can see, my page reloads automatically because I have my live server going on, and I managed to link the CSS file correctly. And I have some rules going on here as well, okay, which says color red. Okay, so let's look at what's happening here. So you probably could have guessed what color is doing over here and why is it red. Okay, but I'll sort of like go through a little bit more about what this code means. But let me first explain to you the whole chunk of how this sort of like this structure of CSS code, and explain every single section. Okay, so first of all, I want you guys to look at this first section, which is obviously the first word over here, body. Okay, this is what we call CSS selector. Okay, and this is very important, and you actually use it even in JavaScript. Okay, CSS selector. What is CSS selector? The idea of writing CSS, right, is based on the premise that you have to be able to select the particular element of the page. Then you set the rules to it. Okay, you must be able to select first. If you're unable to select anything, obviously the rules do not know which element on the page to apply the elements to apply the styles to. For example, over here, this is our most basic form of selector, this one over here. Why? Because if you just write a name just like that, we are basically describing what tags are we trying to refer to. So for example, over here, I'm trying to refer to H1. All I need to do is come down to here and write H1. That's it. Okay. So CSS only in Python though. CSS selector is not exclusive to CSS and JavaScript. You can use it anywhere as well. Okay, not just JavaScript. Right. So for example, over here, I'm trying to look for H1. That's why I just write H1 in my CSS selector. Let's say I'm trying to refer to li. Okay. If I were to do that, all I need to do is just change it to li. Save it, scroll down, you should be able to see all the list items turn to red. Okay, so you roughly get the idea, right? So if I were to select any tag, all I need to do is just write the name of the tag, all right? Nothing special, just write the name of the tag. No quotation mark, no nothing, just write the name of the tag. And then the second part is you have the curly brackets. Every rules that are any of the rules that's located inside the curly bracket, we basically define it as these rules belong to this CSS selector. Okay, this CSS selector. It will only apply to elements that basically satisfies this CSS selector over here. Okay, so this is basically these are the rules. You have your color, and then the value that is set to is red. Okay. Also note that each rule needs to end with a semicolon. Not colon, it must be semicolon. All right, you can't write it with a full stop or whatever, it must be semicolon. Okay. So you encounter problems if you don't end each rule with a semicolon, especially when you're writing multiple rows, which is very, very common in CSS. If you want to add more rules, more than one rule per selector, make sure that you go to the next line and write your second rule, and then second value, end it with a semicolon. You must do this, okay? Now, CSS is actually a very, how should I say it? It's a very shallow technology, okay? It's very shallow, but there are a lot of CSS rules out there, okay? Each doing very, very different things, and sometimes have to be paired with multiple other CSS rules, right? In order to create one single effect, okay? But CSS is like a never-ending journey of like learning experience. Okay, even I myself, I probably can't remember some of the very, very like ulu CSS rules that you don't use very often. Okay, but I'll try to cover only the crucial ones, just enough for you to build a decent website, all right, to create a simple layout in today's workshop. So let's explore a little bit more into CSS selectors. Okay, as I mentioned previously, CSS selectors allows us to sort of like pinpoint the element on the HTML document to apply our styles to. We've encountered our first most basic CSS selector, which is the type selector. Okay, type selector, which just involves you writing the name of the tag. Okay. And then the second type of selector involves extra attributes, all right? So let me go back to HTML. So as you can see, we've got a couple of attributes going on here. We've got rel, href, some type, src, and all that. So that's cool. But there are two additional attributes that's basically exclusively available for you to be able to use your CSS and group a couple of items together under a single name. Okay, one of them is called classes. Class. Okay, the class attribute. Now, this class attribute is available on almost every single element. Okay, every single element. H1, I can put a class there. Let's see, I can write class full, let's say, right? Class is equals to full. This basically says that, hey, H1 has a class full, right? So in the event, if I want to refer to this in my CSS selector, all I have to do is come back to my CSS, and I will say something like dot full, right? So what is this dot for? Dot is there for us to indicate that the following chunk of text over here is actually referring to a class. Please look for any elements that has the class full, okay? Any elements, because I didn't define any type or anything, I just define class, right? If you were to put at the front, right, if you were to put, let's say, I want to put H1. So what this means is that H1.full, I'm trying to look for any H1s with the class full. Okay, that's how you sort of like combine CSS selector. It isn't just one single selector, one way of writing selectors. It's how you combine those values. And obviously that has to match with your document, because if they couldn't find any elements that matches your CSS selector, your rules just goes nowhere, right? It doesn't affect anything. So I want you guys to pay attention to when I use my mouse, as you can see, I'm moving my mouse around. If I hover on top of the CSS selector, right? If you're using Visual Studio Code, this is a Visual Studio Code feature. If you're Visual Studio Code, when you hover on top of h1.full over here, you can see there's like this chunk of HTML appearing on my tooltip. This is what we call tooltip, okay? So this is trying to tell you that this selector that you have just written is trying to refer to H1 that has the class full. So in the event when you're done writing a CSS selector, and then you're like, I don't know whether my CSS selector means the way I'm trying to select my stuff, right? Did I write my CSS selector correctly? Am I selecting my items correctly? If you ever have that kind of question, all you need to do is hover on top of this, and then you should be able to see what's happening over here, right? Is this what you want, okay? So usually you just look at this, and then you probably just match it onto your HTML file, and then you see, oh, this is what I want. Okay, then it's agreed, okay? You can proceed, and your CSS rule will most likely apply, okay? So that's one, that's classes. Now, what are classes useful for? Because I've only linked one. You can use this to link multiple elements. It is not just to say, hey, H1 can have H1 has class full. You cannot other elements cannot have full anymore. Doesn't work that way. Let's say this ally, I can just put a new class full as well. Okay, you're not exactly locked to a single type once you put a single class on the very first element. Let's say. Okay, so if I save this thing, I probably have to come back to my CSS and change this one particular line, because my CSS selector doesn't make sense anymore, right? As you can see, I'm trying to select h1.full, and that only works for this only h1.full. L1 with class full doesn't match that CSS selector anymore. So what do you have to do? You probably have to come back to your CSS selector and revise this rule. You probably want to remove this chunk, because that is the chunk of selector that is restricting your CSS selector from selecting any other elements for class full. Okay, so for example, I'm going to write color red as well. I'm just going to stick with that. my H1 turns to red. Okay, that's correct. If I scroll down, my li item, which is the first item, okay, let's look at my HTML. My first item turns to red as well. Okay, so that's how you basically group things together. And usually, this is good enough for a lot of purposes. You can group multiple elements to write a single CSS rule. All right. And then in the situations where you need to write multiple CSS classes, right? HTML classes over here. Let's say if this thing needs to belong to class foo. What if this thing needs to belong to class bar as well? All you need to do is write with a single space in between. Please don't put a comma here, put a semicolon or whatever. Just put a comma, just put a space, okay? Single bar over here. Right? So this H1 will now have two classes, okay? And what you can do over here is, what if you can write dot bar color to maybe green, okay? As you can see, the title now turns to green and the list item is still green, okay? Because why? This is after the first rule, okay? So it's sort of like overriding each other. Okay, so first you do this, then after you do that. So if you guys are familiar with Python, where your code executes from top to bottom, this should be roughly the same behavior. Now there are a couple of other sort of like rules in the background, specificity to be specific. They do a lot of like background deconflicting and then see which one is stronger, right? See which one takes over or anything. But that's kind of complicated, and I don't really want to confuse you guys, especially when you guys are new to CSS. So just take it as if which one comes after. Okay, so that usually covers like a good 90%, 99% of your use cases. Okay, now a second way of sort of like labeling your HTML elements is using ID. Okay, ID. ID compared to classes, they are basically very, very similar, except classes you can use to tag multiple items. ID, you can only use it to tag one single item, okay? So as you can see, we used ID in our last workshop to basically write our input, okay? So what this means is that, hey, my input has an ID username. You're not supposed to put another ID called username here as well. Okay, you're not supposed to. Although the browser will try to compensate and then be like, okay, I'll try to render it for you, but you know some behaviors won't work the same, right? This is what you need to avoid. Okay, the browser won't specifically come and tell you that you're doing something wrong. But you need to be aware that IDs are unique. It needs to be unique on the page, right? So for example, this page has an ID of username, one single element with an ID username. That means the same page cannot have any elements with the same ID anymore. You can have ID username one, that works, but you cannot have ID username again, okay? Okay, CSS on a single line of code, inline CSS. Yeah, okay, inline CSS works as well, but tell you what, it's actually, how to say, it's quite noisy for the HTML, right? What is it? What do I mean by noisy? You have extra excess information on your HTML that you probably don't want to look at most of the time. Okay, and especially when you're like, okay, I'm done with the styles. Now let me code up the functionality. Then let me code up the structure. Those inline CSS will be like, it's noise, right? It's information that you do not need at that moment of time. Okay, so that's why we usually try to push it to styles of CSS. We keep all those things separate. Okay. You probably have to see what's wrong with your CSS. Did you link your CSS correctly? Did you write your href to CSS styles or CSS correctly, or whatever file that your CSS is labeled as? Or did you have your server up and running properly, right? If you have, then you probably want to test your HTML, write some changes. Does it reload automatically? Okay. Okay, so to basically refer to IDs, right? Well, let me go back. Okay, where is this ID? I lost it. Yeah, ID equals to specific H1, let's see. Okay, specific H1. So this ID, H1 has a specific H1 ID over here. All right. So if you were to write this such a ID over here, but I'm trying to write a CSS selector to select this, all I need to do is come back to my CSS. I write a hash. Okay. Hash is used to indicate what's it called? IDs. Okay. Dot or period is used to indicate classes. So you write hash and then I'll write specific dash ID. Okay. Don't worry about the dash. The dash basically creates one single name. Okay. So if you don't like dashes, you can put underscore. Okay, this works just the same. But make sure you change when you change here, you come back to HTML and change the same thing. Okay, because they don't know the existence of each other. You have to be diligent and change both sides. Okay. Over here, I'll do the same thing. I'll write color red. Okay, which is probably not as exciting because you just see the title as red. Specific H1. Oh, sorry, not specific ID. Specific H1. Save. Right. That's how you refer to IDs. Okay, so there are two ways for you to refer to elements on your HTML page, either with either using type selector, where you just write the what's it called, the name of the tag, or you can use classes. Okay, or you can use IDs as well. Okay, three methods. So there are a lot more methods for you to write CSS selector. You can choose, like you can have logic, the first child and second child and all that. But that's beyond the scope of this workshop. If you are interested, you can probably refer to documentations online. For example, let me just show you at the end. CSS selector. Yeah, so there's a good page on all the CSS selectors. There are a lot more, okay? But if you just use the three that I just showed you just now, it should suffice for most of your MVP projects that you want to demonstrate. So when do you need to use class? When do you need to use ID? Very good question. When you want to group multiple items together under a single name, that's when you use classes. When you only want to target one single item, there's enough sort of like namespace. What do we mean by namespace? Let's say I want to label this as specific H1. If I already have a specific H1 on this page, that is what I mean by namespace. This thing has already hoarded that single name. Okay. So again, if you want to tag multiple or label group multiple elements together, you use classes. If you only want to select one item, you can use ID, or you can still use classes. Classes doesn't mean that you must have multiple elements together. You can still put one item on that class, and that works just fine. In fact, you can get away from using only classes. Okay, you can just forget about ID and just use classes all the way. That works as well, no problem. Okay. So in the event that you always you find yourself, say I'm writing CSS and I don't know whether my CSS selector is correct or not, always fall back. Oops, sorry, click something wrongly. Always fall back to hovering on top of your CSS role and finding your this tooltip over here. As you can see, this says element not because there's an element tag. It just says that any element. Okay, any element. All right, so the next section is I'm going to talk about developer tools, all right, on browsers, because when we work with like web apps and all that, when we want to sort of like check, are we doing things right? Am I writing my CSS correctly and all that? You have to come back here and open your developer tools. Okay, CSS indentation sensitive. No, not really. Can write everything in one line. That works as well. No, not indentation sensitive. Instead of VS Studio, Visual Studio Code, Anika. Yeah, you can use Replit as well. No problem. Okay, but you just need to know how to download your whole application when you're done or when you're ready to deploy. You just need to know how to download, all right? But Anika, if you can, I would highly suggest you to get your Visual Studio Code up and running, because the next workshop will be dealing with Node.js, which highly involves you having the setup on your computer. Okay, so you probably want to explore that as well. Okay, so right. So next one, I'm going to talk about the developer tools, right? So developer tools. So what you want to do is on your computer, on your browser, make sure you have that focused, like click onto it. Depending on your platform, whether you're on Mac, whether you're on Windows, what you do is, if you're on Mac, let me address Mac first. If you're on Mac, please press Command Option I. Okay, Command Option I. That brings you this window over here. If you're on Windows, please press F12. F12 if you have the key on your keyboard, all right? How do you link to other texts within the same page? Do you use the tag? Oh, okay. Link to other texts, as in like an anchor tag. So what you can do is on your link, instead of page2.html, you just write the ID. Let's say this ID specific h1, you just write hashtag specific h1. Then when you click on this link, your browser window jumps to this h1 over here. Okay. Oh, I lost the chat. Where's my chat? Yeah. Okay, that works. But you can only use ID for this. It doesn't work for classes. So you must use ID. All right. That's the only thing that they need to be aware of. This was page2.html, right? So depending on your platform, you must bring up this developer tools. If you're on Windows, Command Option I. If you're on, if you're on Mac, Command Option I. If you're on Windows, F12. Okay. Yes, good debug. You found sometimes you might need to press FN F12. That is when your laptop or keyboard is configured to have, sometimes your media keys, right? Louder, how to say, increase the volume, mute, and all that is taking over the FN functionality, all the F1s and all that. You probably have to press FN for that, right? Oh, Chromebook. Good question. I have no idea. You probably have to Google, how do you bring up developer tools on your Chromebook? Okay, but it's roughly the same way. If you're on Chromebook, I think F12 works probably quite universal. Okay, so yeah, so this developer tools is basically us taking a look at the insides of our HTML page over here. So my layout looks like this. If depending on how zoomed in your developer tools is, you look very, very different. So let's say if I press Command plus, or on your side, if you're Windows, Control plus or minus, if I keep zooming in, you can see how the layout changes, right? So if I keep zooming in, you suddenly see there's a bottom bar going on here, which is basically what was on the right, but now it's on the bottom. If I zoom out, then it's now on the right. Okay, so it is really depending on how zoomed in you are. So you just have to get used to it. You just find your tools. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to use your developer tools over here. So if you have multiple rules applying on the single element, let's say this element, it's red right now, but I remember if I coded up my CSS, it should be green, right? So if you feel there's something wrong going on, you can open up your developer tools, and what you do is you can click on this icon over here, okay, on the top left corner. You should have this icon on your, regardless if you're on Mac, if you're on Windows. If you click on this, coming back to your page, you should be able to select all these elements, okay? So clicking on this element over here, let's say this H1, if I hover on top of it, there's like this tooltip going on here. Let me draw. Oops, can't draw. Yeah, this tooltip going on here, which gives you like a good summary of all the CSS rules that's available there and all that. Okay, if you want to discover more, just click onto it and your developer tools will come into focus. On the sidebar or the bottom bar, depending on how zoomed in you are, you can see all these CSS rules that's applied onto your web page, okay, onto this particular element, right? Or should I say? So this chunk is by the browser. So don't worry about this. This is by the browser. The browser is doing all this styling for you. This is what you wrote. This is what you wrote. And as you can see, my styles of CSS line 1, I have this code over here, color red. Okay. That's how you use developer tools. Okay. Usually you just need to make sure that you select your items correctly. Okay. If you can't find your items or there's something wrong that you can't select, you just come in here and select the element manually, right? You should be able to recognize your HTML structure and compare it with your developer tool structure. They should be roughly the same, almost the same, okay? All right, so I'm gonna talk about a couple of common CSS rules, okay? Running out of time, but let's try to do this as fast as we can. So just now we talked about CSS color over here. So what is color? You probably would have guessed what color does. Okay, it's not the color of the box or color of the page or whatever. It is the color of your text. Okay, so just bear in mind when you're writing color, when you write the CSS rule color over here, you're referring to the text color. Again, if you wrote a CSS rule and then you're like, oh, I forgot what this rule is for, I think you can hover on top of it and then there should be some sort of like informative tooltip that tells you what this thing does, okay? Or again, you can come back to MDN, this web page over here. I can share you the link right here. Oops. Yeah, share you the link. So this is a very good sort of like documentation for everything that you need to know about the web. Okay, everything should be here. Okay. All right, so that's color. Okay, so what kind of values can you put inside here? There are some predefined colors that the browser recognizes. For example, red, magenta, cyan, blue, blah, 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 and all that. Okay, so you probably want to use another color because most of the time the colors that they come preloaded is very neonish. Okay, how do I tell you whether it's neonish? It's like in your face. Okay, you probably don't want those colors. So if you're looking for like very soothing color, very pastel kind of color, what I recommend you guys do is go to this web page over here, coolers.co. I'm not sure how to pronounce this, coolers, okay? So if you navigate to this app, blah, 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 no, start generator, yeah. So it's basically like a lottery generator where you hope you strike a good color, okay? So you just keep on pressing your space key and then you just cycle through to a color that you want. If you look, let's say if I like a color, let's say maybe this blue looks very googly, right? What I can do is I can probably click on this color, right? Select this value, copy this thing and paste it inside here. But make sure you prepend this with a hash, okay? You must have a hash at the front, okay? So this is what we call a hex color, hex value, okay? And what happens here is it will be recognized and then they should be able to load your color correctly, okay? Mozilla has something to do with Firefox. Yes, Firefox is one of their browsers as well, but Mozilla is also, the MDN is also one of the sort of like the deciding body of how the web should and should not work, okay? So yeah, this is how you choose colors. Okay, I'm not going to explain what this all these numbers mean, but the name for this layout is called hex code, right? So if you're looking for this, there's a name for it. It's called hex code. Okay, so I'll share you this page over here. You guys can explore. load. Okay, not loading, don't worry. Now, next rule that I want to talk about is background color. Okay, and usually the rules are quite self-descriptive. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention color over here. If you guys are used to American English spelling or British English spelling, this is American English spelling. Okay, if you are used to writing COLOUR, you probably want to just bear that in mind. Although I think now browsers are quite smart, they usually take these things into account. But some of the rules, they still use American English spelling. So you probably want to pay attention to that. Okay. Oh yeah, let me share this page, share it to everyone. Okay, so the next rule I'm going to talk about is background color. Yes, background color. So the way background color works is basically if you write a color over here, let's say if I write maybe yellow, save. As you can see, the whole box turns into yellow over here. Okay, so this is what background color does. It basically turns the whole box into yellow color. And how do you know where is the box? Usually, with background color, you should see where this box is going to extend to, where is it going to, how tall is this box and all that. Okay, so background color is pretty useful in that sense. And another value of color that you can use is RGBA. Okay, RGB should be pretty self-explanatory. Colors, as you guys would have known, RGB stands for red, green, and blue. Usually colors are represented by these three values. A stands for alpha, okay, or also it can be presumed as opacity. Okay, opacity basically says how transparent you want this to be and all that. So so you can set color and also set some opacity to it. Okay, so this is quite useful as well, especially when you want to have this effect when you can see a couple of the things in the background, maybe you have a picture in the background. Okay, that's background color. So RGB is a value, and each value needs to be separated with a comma. And then the last value is a value from 0 to 1. Let's say I put 0.8. So what is 0, 0, 0? First value goes to R, second value goes to G, third value goes to B. All right. So each value basically goes up to 255. Okay, the max value, basically 0 to 255. All right. But usually, if you're like looking for this color and all that, I advise you to come to Schoolers, look for the color, generate a color in RGB, then maybe add your own alpha. Okay, just adjust your own alpha. All right, and then after that, we have fonts. Okay, so let's try to do some fonts. So to create fonts, to import fonts, usually fonts are quite expensive. Right? If you look for foundries and then you have to buy license and all that, they usually cost around thousands of dollars. Okay, and when you're like, oh, I just want to develop like a hobby website, right? I just want to create a website for my MVP, for hackathon and all that. Where am I going to find fonts? And usually web fonts are, look at these fonts, default fonts are quite ugly, right? If you ever want to find fonts that is free, okay, all you need to do, you just have to go to your browser, look for Google Fonts. Okay, let's share this page over here. Right, fonts.google.com. Right, so they have a good, healthy number of free fonts that you can use that you don't even need to download or anything. All you need to do is you must have some internet connection and put in some code into your HTML. That's all. Okay. So for example, you can see my text over here looks kind of ugly. What I can do here is I'm going to come back to my fonts over here, look for a nice looking one, maybe this one, Balu, Tamudu. All right. So I'm going to click on this. And you can see there are a couple of styles over here, right? So choose the style that you want, maybe regular, okay? You click on regular. Select this style. So it's basically like shopping, right? So you're shopping for fonts, etc. Everything is free, okay? So if you click onto it, your card, right, something like a card, right, basically shows you the fonts that you've selected, and they will basically generate something that looks like this, okay? And if you still remember our CSS HTML rule over here that imports our CSS file, you should feel right at home, right? You should basically notice there are some similarities over here. For example, there's rel going on here as well. There's href, except the href is not linking to a file that is inside our folder. It's linking to a remote resource, like it's not on your computer. That's why you can see https://fonts Google API.com blah blah blah. All right. So what you guys want to do is just copy this whole chunk, copy this, and come in here and paste this onto your CSS. What you guys want to do is now in this situation, order methods, okay? Please try to paste it before your own CSS. So reformat this. Okay. Please try to paste this before your own CSS, okay? Because why? If you want to use this inside your own CSS, you want to refer to this font. Obviously, it needs to be preloaded first, okay? So this is how you sort of like arrange this order, okay? Not available anymore. What will happen? Oh, not available anymore. It's kind of rare. They usually have all these fonts for eons. Usually, once it's up there, it should be on eons. If the font is removed or anything, you as a developer, no, not you as a developer, the user will be the first to know, right? They will be able to see, oh, how come the website looks different now, right? Where is the nice looking font? So when that happens, you probably have to go straight into opening up your code and find a new font and replace the code. Okay. All right. So I'm not going to go through what this two line means. All right. Just leave it there. And then in our CSS, they also tell you how are you going to use this particular rule. So all you need to do is just copy this line of code, copy this, come into your CSS, and paste this. Okay. As you can see, there's this rule going on here called font family. Okay. So font family is a way for you to sort of like choose, right? To specify, sorry, the word specify, to specify the font that you're trying to use for this particular CSS selector, right? So make sure that before you use this, obviously, your HTML needs to have, these two lines ready, okay? It's basically you shopping for anything that any fonts that you want. But whenever you choose a new font, let's say I added a new font or anything, you can see the link still looks roughly the same, except they have a couple of like extra information here that allows them to download and import more fonts for you. You just have to copy the whole thing and come back to here and replace these two lines again. Okay, you just have to do that. Copy these two lines. The first line won't change. You can copy the last line if you manage to differentiate which one is the one that you're trying to replace. Okay. Oops. Auto save, please, on window change. All right. So that's your font family, okay? So if you ever have to change the regular, medium, semi-bold, bold, or whatever, apart from just setting font family, you have to set another rule called font weight, okay? Font weight. What is this weight for? It is basically for you to specify which variation that you want over here. If you downloaded 400, 500, 600, and all that, and you want to choose one of them, you have to specify font weight and then the number that you want, okay? So for example, I have medium, you want to choose 500, okay? Just like that. But if you only have one font with one single weight, you don't even have to choose this. They will automatically find that one particular weight that you have and then just load it up, right? And then after that, we have font size. Okay, font size. So font size, right? So font size takes values, right, in terms of pixels. Okay, so what's a pixel? I'm not sure if I talked about that. Oh yeah. So what's a pixel? Pixel is just basically you can assume it as a single pixel on your screen, but depending on the screen, like let's say if you're on MacBooks, they have retina display where they basically put 4 pixels as a single pixel. That's why it looks very sharp and all that. Or if you have those advanced technology displays, sometimes that 1 pixel that you see here doesn't actually translate to a physically 1 pixel, like a 1 physical pixel. So, but the idea here is you just have to try around the numbers, and then once you get to a rough idea as to how many pixels is 50 pixels, then you can see on your screen. You should get a very rough estimation as to how you should adjust your values. So, for example, over here, if I set this thing to maybe 50 pixels, you can see how it becomes bigger, right? So you roughly know, oh, 50 pixels look like this. Then you adjust from there. Okay. Usually, what I advise you to do is do it in the multiples of 8. Okay, do it in the multiples of 8. There's a whole study about how multiples of 8 is a lot more pleasing to the eye, right, to human eyes, especially when everything is of multiples to 8. If you don't like 8, maybe multiples of 6, that works too, all right? But the idea here is that, I mean, just don't pick a value out of nowhere and use it, okay? Just try to follow multiples of 8. And then after that, we have border radius. Okay, so border radius. What is border radius? So every component has sort of like this line outlining this thing, right? So if you ever want to do border radius, what is border radius for is basically to control the edge over here, this edge, the corners, okay? So if I were to say, let's say 16 pixels, save, as you can see, the corners are basically rounded off, right? Okay, so, and if you provide big enough values, let's say 999 pixels, it turns into this pill looking thing, okay? So that's probably, maybe that's something what you want, right? And as you can see, the text is kind of out of the box, right? So maybe what you can do is you can do text align. Text align takes in a couple of values, as you can see. VS Code shows you all these values, but the more important ones is probably left, right, and center. Okay, so let's say if I put center, and it goes to the center. Okay, so let's text align. Next up, we have opacity. Okay, so what is opacity? As what I mentioned before with your colors over here, RGBA. A stands for alpha. Also, also you can be referred to as opacity. Opacity over here, if you're putting on the element itself, it basically affects the whole element. Okay, not just the background color. For example, over here, if I put background color 0.2, you see how it's very faint, but the text is still very clear. But let's say if I change this back to 1, change my opacity to 0.2. You see how everything turns into this faded looking code, looking element. Okay, so it really depends on where you want to put the opacity. Where do you want to make the background slightly transparent, or do you want to make the whole thing transparent? Okay. How would you query all the possible attributes for styling? I won't say query. What you do is you come into more MDN, and then you look for CSS and see all the CSS rules they have over here. Okay, so that's how you look for them. But there are just so many rules, like there are thousands of them. Okay, so if you want to like see an exhaustive list, then it's probably quite overwhelming. Okay, So, or rather, what I would highly recommend here is you probably want to go through this section over here, sales tutorials. Okay, so they give you a couple of very good examples. Okay, like the very most important ones. Okay, so you can go through them. Especially, I can't cover every single rule here, especially with given the time constraints. Okay, so make sure you visit Mozilla over here, developer Mozilla. Okay, so with that, I'll end the CSS section off over here, but I'll give you some pointers for things that you guys should look into on separately on your own time. For example, you need to look at CSS Flexbox, CSS Grid, and CSS Box Model. Okay, 3 items over here, not in this order. Sorry. Okay, let me switch this up. Yeah, in this order. Okay, so make sure you look into box model first, then you look into Flexbox. CSS Grid is really the last thing that you should learn. Once you have Flexbox, that should solve 99% of your layout problems or requirements. Okay. Okay, yeah, that's CSS. I'm going to move on to JavaScript. Okay. Okay, because the bulk of the functionality that we need from our web application heavily relies on JavaScript. Okay, we need JavaScript to get our application working. So we discussed about how HTML provides content and structure to your web application, and then how CSS is used to provide styles and prettify your web application. We also use the analogy in the context of a house, HTML being your house and your where your rooms are located and arranged. CSS is the interior designer coming in to lay out your sofa, your bed, clean the walls and all that. The next component of a web page after HTML and CSS is JavaScript, or JS in short. JavaScript, how do you write JavaScript? I see a lot of developers writing this wrongly. JavaScript with a capital J and capital S, okay, not Java script, like this, not this, all right? So using the same analogy, JavaScript is this electrician coming into your house, fix up all the wirings, giving you all the functionalities to your button switches to turn on lights, to turn on your air conditioner, or maybe install smart home features, like turn on the lights automatically at 5 and 9 a.m. or something like that. Okay, so that's what JavaScript is for in the context of your web page, right? So JavaScript is the programming language of HTML and the web. It is not the only, but it is the most popular one. Okay, it is used to add interactive features to your websites, including dynamically updated content. Let's say when you're going to your Gmail, and when you receive an email, it automatically updates on your screen and all that. So that's all JavaScript. Okay. So you can control media, multimedia, all your YouTube experience, they're all on JavaScript, animated images and much more, right? So JavaScript also exclusively was provided what we call the HTML DOM API. Okay, HTML DOM API that allows JavaScript to directly control your document, okay, using a programming language, which is JavaScript, okay? So we'll try to cover basic language features because if you guys have gone through Mr. Wawai's Beginning Python series, you guys would have a decent understanding or a decent foundation of how language features works, right? For example, you have your strings, your numbers, your lists, your dictionaries and all that. Everything translates to JavaScript, all right? Except probably with like some minor differences, maybe the names are different. So that's why it's very cool that once you have learned your first language, or when you're familiar with the first language, your other languages, other programming languages just comes very, very easily to you. Okay, the only hurdle that you guys will probably face is mastering that first language, right? So now, for us to work with JavaScript, what I want you guys to do is now to create a JavaScript file in your project folder. So same thing over here, we're going to create a next file. So we're going to create a new file using this button over here and probably call it scripts.js. Script or scripts.js. Either way works. Okay. So again, the naming doesn't really matter. Okay. Not as important as index.html. What's important over here is you must have your script.js. The file extension is what matters. Okay. So I'm going to go real quick covering basic JavaScript features. So once we have our JavaScript file, you would want to come into your HTML file and do the same process. You want to link your JavaScript file to your HTML file. So instead of using the link over here, we're going to use another tag, right? And even the location is different. So I want you guys to go down to right before the closing tag of your body, right before your body closing tag. Okay, this one over here. And now we're going to write a new line and script : src. Press tab. Okay, script : src. Now this is quite a lot shorter than what it was for style sheet over here, CSS over here. But don't worry if you ever forget them. Okay, it's pretty easy. Script : src, and there's another one, link : css. That's all. Okay, link : css is for CSS. Script : src is for JavaScript. Okay. So over here, there's a closing tag, but it is mainly used for people who want to write JavaScript directly on the HTML page itself. Okay. Not that I recommend it. Please try to write it. Just attach a new file separately. Okay. So over here, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to label it as script.js. Okay. That's it. It's safe. All right. And then coming back to your script.js, obviously we need to test whether this thing works or not, right? Whether this thing, have I linked it properly? Same thing as what we did with our CSS file. Okay. So coming back to your web page over here, right? We don't really worry about this for now. For what I want you guys to do is go back to your developer tools. Okay, go back to your developer tools. Anika, possible to do CSS and HTML. HTML can do anything. You can put all your CSS, put all your JavaScript in there. If you're writing very simple CSS, then yes, feel free to go write CSS in HTML. But what I highly recommend is create a separate file, right? Because you're trying to separate the noise from your HTML file. Okay, because understanding the structure is much more important than the inconvenience of creating a new file. Okay, so we're going to look at the developer tools. Okay, now we're not going to look at styles, look at elements and all that. We're not going to look at those anymore. What I want you guys to pay attention to is your console tab over here. Okay, same thing depending on how zoomed in you are. I think the console tab sometimes appears, sometimes disappears. Let's say if I zoomed in like this, you won't be able to see the console tab, right? So just need to bear that in mind. Okay, make sure you click on console. You should be able to see this, right? So this is actually your JavaScript engine. Okay, your JavaScript, you can run your JavaScript here, you can write your JavaScript code here if you just want to run like a 1-2 line. Okay, but obviously this is not the ideal way to write any JavaScript code. Okay, so what I want you guys to do is you come back to your script.js. Okay, just to test whether this thing is working. What I want you guys to do is we're going to write console.log. Okay, now if you guys come from Python, you guys are familiar with print. Okay, print, and then you put some values inside there, right? So that was your Python. Okay, but in JavaScript you don't use print. Okay, you use console.log. All right, console.log allows us to write, basically just print this whatever value that you pass to this console.log, and it will basically show up on your console over here, this one over here. Okay, so if you want to do 1, 2, 3, save this, you can see there's 1, 2, 3 going on. Okay, which is cool. That's exactly what we want. Our HTML page manages to load our script.js properly. Our script.js properly loads, runs this particular line of code, and it shows up on the console. Okay, so that's console.log. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is I'm just going to go through very basic feature, features of JavaScript because Python and JavaScript is slightly different, okay, just slightly, but it pays to know these differences, okay, especially when you're writing JavaScript. So first and foremost, when you're declaring variables, remember in Python, you just write, let's say foo is equal to 1. You can do so. But in JavaScript, please always declare them with a keyword, either let or constant. Bar is equal to 2, let's say. Okay, so what is let? What is const? So this is something like a mathematical terms, right? Let x equals to 1, let y is equals to 2, or something like that. So constant over here basically obviously is quite self-explanatory. Let allows you to declare a variable where you can then change this, reassign a new value to this variable. Okay, which is kind of weird because in Python you felt like, hey, that was a given, right? I could change my variable value to anything, right? But in JavaScript, they give you the choice, okay, to either declare variables like this, you put let, or you write constant and basically lock it down to only one value, right? Not to say one value, lock it down to the value that you define it with, okay? So why is there such a thing? It is basically there to prevent unwanted behavior. Like let's say your variable is getting reassigned out of nowhere, right? So if you manage to use constant in a good manner, you basically are able to prevent your code from being reassigned to different values, right? Basically preventing bugs, right? So what I recommend is you guys please try to declare variables using constant first. Let's say bar is equals to some value. And when further down the road, if you ever encounter a situation where your logic requires you to reassign this value, okay, oh no, my logic, I need to reassign this value, no choice. Then you come back to change your declaration to let, okay? Because as programmers, you're not a printer, okay? You don't write from line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You write line 1, 2, 3, maybe you go back to 1, then maybe 5, okay? You're not a printer. So that's the idea of declaring variables. And then we have strings as well. That's what you can see over here, strings. You can use single quotation mark. You can use double quotation mark. Okay, or you can use what we call, in Python, you call it F strings, okay? I'm not sure if you guys still remember that. F strings allows us to, what's it called, to insert, basically just plug in variables in the middle of strings, okay? It's very, very useful. JavaScript has such a feature as well, except the syntax is slightly different, okay? So instead of using double quotation mark, single quotation mark, you have to use backticks, okay? So for those who aren't familiar with backticks, it is the key next to 1, to the left of 1, okay? So don't need to press shift, just press that key to the left of 1. I think it should apply for all keyboard keys, even with your Mac or Windows, all right? And then after that, inside here, let's say I have a variable called let constant foo is equals to world. What I can do here is I can write $sign with a curly bracket. In the curly bracket, you write the variable that you want to plug in. Okay. So in Python, you don't have the $sign. You use F and then the string, the single quotation mark, and then you put your curly brackets inside your string, and then you can plug in your variables there. But in JavaScript, you cannot use the single quotation mark. You must use backticks. And you can plug in your variables using the $curly bracket syntax, okay? Now this also does multi-line strings, okay? If you remember from Python, you can do multi-lines, right? Python multi-lines, you probably have to do triple quotation mark and all that, okay? But in JavaScript, you can use the same feature, the same quotation marks, the same backticks, and over here you can do your multi-line string, okay? Console.log, what is bar? Save hello world, right? Again, please make sure you declare your variables using const. And only if you ever have a situation when you need lets, then only you change your declaration. Okay, and then how do you join strings together? I really think this is the best way. Okay, if you know this way, you probably don't need any other ways, but I'll just show you for the sake of demonstration. Maybe you want to say zoo is equals to full plus full. Okay, full plus full. What is plus? You're trying to concatenate. Okay, concatenates. Okay, right. You're trying to concatenate two strings together. Okay, so that's one feature. And then another feature here is booleans. Right. So in Python, your booleans are like this. True. Oh, no, sorry. Your Python true is capital letter T. Okay, but in JavaScript it is lowercase. Okay, same goes for false. Okay, and as booleans, you guys should know there's only true or false. There's no such thing as sometimes true, sometimes false. Okay, so these are basically the two values. And how do you compare values like operators, logical operators? You can do full and full, full and bar. And in Python was like this, where you have to write, you have to write n, okay, the word n. But in JavaScript, you must use the double ampersand sign, right, which is the double ampersand, which is the shift 7, okay. So this is n. If you want to use or, you cannot write or, you must use double pipe, okay. Where is this double pipe? It is above your enter key. Okay, but you have to press shift for that, right? Double pipe. This is OR, okay? Behavior works exactly the same as in Python. And then you have your usual mathematical operation, larger than or equal to, okay? Sorry about my screen over here. Larger than or equal to, yeah, this is what you're looking at. I have some font settings that basically turns it into this literature that you're looking at. Okay, so that's not how it's supposed to look like. It should be like this, larger than equal to. Yeah, and obviously there's lesser than equal to. And how do you compare whether they're equal? Let's say full is 1, bar is 2. How do you compare them if they're equal? You use triple equal sign. Again, this is my font settings for doing is shenanigans. You have to write triple equal sign. Okay, never mind. Yeah, like this. Okay, triple equal sign, 3 equal signs. Right. And then after that, we have the next data structure, which is arrays. Okay. So what's an array? Array is basically your list in Python. Okay. So to create arrays, you would use the same syntax, square brackets again, nothing special here. Well, let's say 1, 2, 3. The triple equal sign does equality, whether this is equal to that. Okay, because a single equal sign means assignment, triple equal sign means equality. You're trying to compare whether this is equal to that. Okay, so full 1, 2, 3 over here. This is an array of 3 values, 1, 2, and 3. They call it array here. In Python, they call it lists. Okay, this is what I meant by sometimes same data structure, but they call it differently. Okay, but when you're Googling, right, it probably pays to remember these names. Okay, because it helps if you're looking for the correct term. Okay, and then to refer to values, let's say full, I'm going to refer to the first value, full 0. Index starts from 0. Okay, if you're familiar with Python, this should be quite natural to you. The last item, you cannot write -1. I know this is a feature in Python, but in JavaScript, you don't have such a thing. Okay, although they are trying to get this feature in, but not so soon. All right. What you can do is you can do full.length -1. Right, -1. This, I'll leave it to you to figure out the logic. Okay, not very difficult, but what happens here is that I'm trying to get the array's length minus 1. Okay, so instead of getting minus 1 index, I'm trying to get the last index. Okay, so that's how you will refer to individual items inside your array. And then after that, we have your 2 arrays. Let's say, yes, this one over here. This one is quite important. Let's say constant full bar, and we have 4, 5, 6. Okay, how do you combine these 2 arrays? There's a very interesting way for us to combine these 2 arrays. What we can do here is constant. Let's say zoo is equals to create a new array, do a triple dot on full, and do a triple dot on bar. So what this triple dot does is that this is what we call the spread operator. Okay, the spread operator basically dismantles the array, this bracket over here, basically dismantles it and spreads it onto the new array. Okay, so it's better if I just demonstrate what this thing is doing. As you can see, the original array bracket has been dismantled, all right? And the contents has been spread into a new array, okay? This is a new array. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And obviously, if I don't do it this order, I'll probably do it bar first, then only I do full. Then the order matters. 4, 5, 6, then 1, 2, 3, okay? And then after that, we have next data structure, which is dictionaries. Okay. Oh, sorry. Python is called dictionaries, but in JavaScript it's called objects. Objects. All right. So in order for you to do this, what you have to do is you would use the same syntax as in Python. You will use curly brackets. Curly brackets. Okay, curly brackets. Now, over here, if you still remember Python, right? To declare keys in your dictionaries, you have to write it this way. Let's say A. Then you put a value inside there. But in JavaScript, you don't have to write strings as your keys. Okay, you don't have to do that. You can completely omit those and just write like that. Right? So that's the difference between Python and JavaScript. Multiple keys is just you're writing like this. Okay, that's an object already. Okay, and the interesting part about the difference between Python's object, Python's dictionary, and JavaScript's object is when you refer to let's say A over here. I'm going to refer to A. In Python, you will have to write full square bracket, then the string A, right? This was in Python, okay? But you don't have to do this anymore. You can just write full.a, full.a. If it's inside an object, just write full.a. If full.b, just change this to B, just like that, right? Okay, so obviously, you can reassign this value. Let's say full.a is equals to hello. You can reassign this. And obviously, if you try to console log the whole full out, you will see A is now hello, B is now true. Okay. All right. So what if you have something like this? Bar is equals to C3D4. What if you have a structure like this? It's pretty common, like just now, we're trying to combine 2 arrays together. It's pretty common in this situation where you want to combine objects as well, okay? So combining objects is pretty similar to how we combine arrays. We are going to use the triple dot syntax as well. So let's say I'm going to call this a new object is equals to a new object of dismantle spreading your full, then spreading your bar. We're going to use the same syntax as well. So over here, I'm trying to create a new object called new obj over here and create a new object using the curly brackets. Then I try to define full over here by spreading it and also spreading bar, right? And then therefore, I can console log and see what new obj is. I can see there's A, B, C, D, right? So this is me creating a new object with the contents from full and bar. And this is pretty common. You do this quite often, okay? So it's good to get you guys used to this concept now. Right? And then after that, the order matters here. No, the order doesn't matter, sorry. Yeah, it doesn't matter if you do this first and then you still get A, B, C, D, because in the objects, order doesn't matter, okay? You put C, D, A, B, it's still the same thing. But what happens if you have A, B, then maybe this is B, this is C, right? So as you can see, there's a conflicting key going on over here because full has A, B, bar has B, C. B is the one that's conflicting over here. So now in this situation, order matters, okay? So for example, I was doing full, dismantling full, then dismantle bar. As you can see now, I have three objects. I have 3 keys instead of 4 keys because there's one conflicting key. The one that gets last applied to will take over the first one, okay? Like over here, B3 comes from what? Comes from bar. That's why it gets override. It gets to override the one from full. If you swap this order, B is now 2 instead, okay? Which is coming from full, okay? So this is an important concept to take note of, right? Especially when you're trying to combine objects and then you suddenly notice that there's conflicting keys going on. If they ever have such a situation, the one that gets dismantled or spread later down the object will get the priority. Concatenate values in objects. Okay. Concatenate with values in objects. Yeah, you can do so as well. Because in strings, right? In strings, right? Let's say constant full is equals. So I can create a string is equals to string hello, and then what I can do here is put a curly bracket and I write full.a. That's all right? Or full.b. Same thing. Does that answer your question? Right. New option not defined. Yeah. Right. And after that, we have functions. How do you declare functions? Functions there are multiple ways to declare functions in JavaScript. Okay, but I'll try to do just one. You guys should be fine if you just use this one way of declaring functions. This way to declare functions is very similar to you assigning a value to a variable. In fact, this is exactly what you're trying to do. I'm going to put the normal parentheses, okay, normal parentheses and equal larger than. So this looks like an arrow, equal and larger than symbol and a curly bracket. You're trying to do a variable, declaring a variable, and I'm trying to assign a value. What value is that? This function is a value. So me declaring this sort of syntax, right? This normal parenthesis, and then your equal and larger than, which basically turns out to look like arrows. And then you have your curly bracket, okay? So this itself is what we call arrow function. And with me doing this, I basically turn full into a function, okay? So in what if I do A, B, or C, right? A, B, C. This is how I declare if this function require arguments, okay? So what I can do here is I'll probably say console.log and I'll try to print all A, B, and C, okay? So this function is pretty simple. So whenever I want to use this function, just full and pass in the value of 1, 2, 3. So let's see. I log this out, I should be able to see what's happening here. Right? So this works fine and everything, but now in Python, it's quite specific that when you declare your functions with certain number of arguments, you cannot disobey that number of arguments. So let's say if I declare a function with 3 arguments, I say I need 3 arguments in Python. And you cannot choose to pass in more, you cannot choose to pass in less, you must pass in that same number of arguments. But in JavaScript, it's pretty lenient, all right? So let's say if I decided to pass in more, I say 4, whatever. So if I save, notice how 4 doesn't appear here because I only console.log ABC, all right? So if I were to make use of the 4th argument over here, I have to come down here and define the 4th variable, 4th argument here so that I can take that extra value, right? But if you don't, that value just goes to nowhere and it doesn't complain. It doesn't tell you that something is wrong. Hey, you passed me more than required. It doesn't tell you all that, right? So it's just a behavior of JavaScript that you need to be aware of. Okay, and then what if you pass in less? The last value would just be undefined. Okay, so notice how the order matters. The first one goes to A, the second one goes to B. It is never one to B, 2 to C. Okay, it will always fill in from the first, second, third, and fourth. So the last one doesn't get any value. That's why it gets a value called undefined. Okay, undefined. When you see undefined, the tip here is you don't want to see this. This is a problem. This is not what we want. Okay, usually when you see this, that means you have to fix your code. Okay, and then now we have your for loops. We are going to create loops. To create loops, all you need to do is create, let's say, an array of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. To create a loop out of this, to loop through every single item, you can use a for loop, and you have to do this this chain of code, which I'll show you in a bit after I finish typing this. Okay, I is lesser than array1 dot length I plus plus. Okay, so this for loop over here indicated by this keyword, followed by a parenthesis and your curly bracket. So this parenthesis over here will be a multiple of items contained in here. Specifically, one is what are you going to initialize it with? Second is the condition for this loop to continue. Third is the operation that this loop is going to execute at the very end of your loop, right? Again and again. So they're going to start with 0, so long I is lesser than array1 dot length. This is the array1's length, okay, which is 5. The last thing that this thing is going to do is I plus plus. What is I plus plus? I plus plus basically means something like I is equals to I plus 1. Okay, it's a shortcut to write this. Okay, you can, if it's confusing to you guys, you can choose to write I is equals to I plus 1. Yeah, you can do this as well. All right. But it's pretty common that you always increment by a value of 1. So it's pretty common to write I plus plus. Then what you do is you probably want to console.log. Let's say whatever I'm doing here, array1 square bracket I. Okay, because I is the one that's going to change every single time you loop. So starting from 0 until the end of this array, which is 4 is less than 5. 5 is no longer less than 5. That's why it's not going to execute. So it's going to stop at 4. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And make sure you squeeze out all the values inside this array. Okay. All right. So that's basic JavaScript features. There's a lot more, but this should get you started. The next one is I'm going to talk about how do you actually access your HTML document, because all the while I'm just like writing your function, your JavaScript arrays, lists, dictionaries, objects, and all that. So how do I actually interact with the HTML document? So as what I mentioned before, JavaScript is provided with a very exclusive HTML DOM API. HTML DOM API. Okay, the way this works is that JavaScript is able to see your HTML document as if it looks like this. Okay, as if it looks like this. So let's say your HTML, you have your head and body. head has a title and amongst other tags. Body has div, and then there's P and A and all that. So this is how JavaScript looks at your HTML. It is able to determine that there's structure going on here, okay, and provide you with those elements using some sort of accessible function and object, okay. So the way this works is that JavaScript was provided with two main variables. One is window, the next one is document. Okay, window is used to when you want to deal with the window itself. Like what? Like let's say your browser window. I want to create a new tab and all that, right? So that's how you use window for. Okay, window is a variable that contains all these functions for you to work with. You can also see how wide is the window, how tall is this window, are you running on Windows, are you running on Mac and all that. So you can get all this information here. Document, on the other hand, is for you to directly work with the document itself, which is the HTML. So whenever we refer to document, right, it's always the HTML, okay? So usually we do one or two things on Windows, but most of the time we touch document more often, okay? So what I want you guys to do is please help me to do this chunk of code. I'll explain what this thing does, okay? I'll explain what this thing does in a bit, but please follow on and type the rest of the code here. Okay, so window.onload is equals to a normal parenthesis, arrow, and a curly bracket. So this is your arrow function, remember? The function that you had, but I'm assigning it to window.onload. Why this is important? This is very crucial. If you ever find yourself having bugs with your code, there's something not going correctly and anything, this is probably it, okay? You must have this in place in your JavaScript code. Because why? If you notice how on the index.html, I put the script.js link over here at the bottom of body. And then now I have this particular chunk of code over here. This two is basically two measures hand in hand trying to assist in the fact that sometimes the HTML page hasn't finished loading yet. Then your JavaScript kicks in, okay? And that's a problem because if your HTML code hasn't loaded yet, hasn't loaded fully, is not on your browser yet and everything, and your JavaScript straight away kicks in, the document isn't even there. Then you're trying to do things to the document, okay? So that's where the bug comes in, okay? So with the combination of us putting the script link at the bottom of the body tag over here and putting window.onload into this function here, this is us basically making sure that the JavaScript only runs after your HTML loads, okay? Only after your HTML finishes loading. So in your function over here, this is where you do all your things. This is where you write all your HTML or CSS JavaScript code, and you can be rest assured that this chunk of code will only be executed after the HTML loads, right? Okay. So the idea of dealing with the document is first you have to select. You have to select HTML elements. Okay, you have to select. So in order for us to select an HTML document, HTML element, you can use the document variable, and they provided you with a couple of functions, very useful functions. Some of them, one of them is called query selector. Query selector. So query selector is a way for you to select an element from a HTML page. Okay, so the idea here is the first thing that you need to do if you want to manipulate your page. You have to select an item from your page, right? You have to select something first. So the idea of how to select an element from your HTML page is you use query selector, then you pass in something what we call CSS selector. So let's see if I want to select H1. Remember your CSS selector from styles of CSS. All these things apply. Okay, you can use the exact same language at this chunk in here. That's why it's very important for you to make sure that you understand your CSS selector well, because it matters in JavaScript as well. Okay. Now, there are other ways for you to select elements. They are like document.get element by ID, get elements by class name, and all that. But it's a lot of methods, and I don't want to confuse you guys. Making sure that I leverage on the fact that you already know your CSS selector, then you only use these two methods, okay, without learning like many other methods. So this basically allows you to select one item, okay? Query selector allows you to select one item and it returns you that particular value. So let's say if I save it into a variable, let's say I call it h1, and I'll see what I can do with this, console.log h1. Saving this thing, opening up my developer tools, you can see that I have a what's it called, console.log going on here with everything properly colored and all that. And this is exactly what I was trying to deal with, okay? If I hover on top of this particular item, you can see how it shows up on my page as well. It's being highlighted as well, okay? So that's pretty important. If you highlighted the wrong item, then you would have immediately known, right? So the idea here is make sure you select your item properly first, then you can do the rest of the things that you want to do. Now, what if you want to select many items? To do that, you must use query selector all, okay? Sorry, let me create a new one. Let's say allies is equals to document.query selector all. So query selector all, they're both very close to each other. Query selector obviously will only select one, even though your CSS selector points to many, like many elements will match this point CSS selector. Let's say you wrote wrongly, but you will get the very first one that matches that CSS selector. Query selector all will grab you all the elements that matches this CSS selector, let's say ally, and basically store it in an array. Okay, where you will have an array of all the elements that matches this CSS selector. Now, what if you don't match anything? You will still get an array of nothing. What if you only match one? You will still get an array of one item, okay? So you must be aware what you're dealing with. Are you dealing with the item, the element itself, or are you dealing with an array, okay? So if it's an array, you usually want to create a for loop. For loop, remember the for loop, right? Then do your let I is equals to 0 and all that. Then you slowly iterate through every single item in your li over here. Okay. So after you have selected your item, okay, usually you want to do a couple of things. So let's say I have h1. Let's say I want to change the contents of this particular page over here. To do that, all you need to do is grab h1, let's say console.log. No, sorry. Let's say I want to change the inner, the contents of this page, this particular element here. After I've selected h1 dots inner HTML is equals to a new value. Let's say hello world. If I save this thing, you can see now the text changed to hello world, right? With HTML works both ways. You can retrieve and you can set, right? So if I do it this way, console.log, what is h1.inner.html? Save this thing, open up your developer tools. I can grab the inner HTML, right? What's inside this thing? So that's inner HTML. And then you have h1.get attributes. Get attribute returns you the attribute of a particular element's attribute value. So for example, h1 has a couple of attributes. One is ID, one is class. So let's say, let me grab ID. I want to grab ID. Okay, so if I save this thing, I can see console.log, I get specific h1, which is the value of that ID, all right? Which is that attribute of ID. And there's get attribute, you have h1.set attribute as well, okay? Except set attribute requires you to pass in two arguments instead. The first argument is your attribute name, right? Obviously, over here I write ID. and I'll change it to a new value. Let's say hello from JS. Save it. As you can see, your HTML now reflects the new change now, right? Hello from JS. And since I changed it to a new ID and all that, you can see how my CSS doesn't work anymore, okay? It's not pointing to the same thing. Now, this works both ways. If you change it to something else that CSS is no longer referring to the correct one, then you lose the style. Or you can now change it to the correct one, to where the CSS is actually has the rules for that particular ID or maybe that particular class. Then you will now adopt that change, that particular CSS rules, and then show up on the screen. Okay, so it works both ways. You can lose styles or you can gain styles, depending on whether you are trying to match it with the styles of CSS or trying to unmatch it from styles of CSS. Okay, so that's set attribute. Or you can do h1 dot list. Okay, class list allows you to retrieve the number of the class items inside your particular element. Okay, so for example, over here, h1.classList. I know that my h1 has class full and bar. That's why when I print h1.classList, I can see that it's an array of full and bar with additional key of value full bar. Okay, so idea here is class list square bracket 0, you will get full, yeah? Square bracket 0, you get full. Save, you see, you get full. What about square bracket 1? You get bar. What about if I change this to value? You get full bar, as in the whole string instead. Okay, so depending on which one you want to work with. So class list also allows you to obviously change values. h1.classList allows you to add a new class. Let's say add hello from JS. Let's see. Save this thing. Come back to your HTML. You can see there's full bar and a new class, hello from JS. Or you can remove it. Remove, let's say I want to remove bar. I don't want bar. Save this thing. You don't see bar anymore. There's only full. Okay. Now, sometimes when you're dealing with like documents, selecting stuff from the document itself is fine. But what about if you want to create elements that wasn't there before? Okay, so to create elements, all you need to do is use document.create element, and then you pass in the name of the element, right? What is the name of the element? So things like div, then you write div. P, then write P. A, img, or what's it called? What else? OL, li, and all that. So this is how you create them. And when you create them, right, it's at this point, it is still inside the JavaScript. It's not on the page. It's still inside the JavaScript, right? As in it's inside your memory and all that. So you need to do an additional step of adding it onto your page. But usually what I'll usually do is we basically do all the steps. Let's say you save this into a variable first. Li is equals to this. You do all the steps where you change your class, change your attributes, set attribute, and all that, and then you do all the work that you need to do. Then at the end of this thing, so let's say I want to add li dot class list dot add. I'll add a new class, and I'll say new li. All right, so this is new class, and then at the end of this thing, I'll do select my body first. Body is equals to document.query selector body. All right, so I've selected body. Body dot append child. Append child is available for you to to basically append stuff, right? So you will add this particular element, this whatever element that you pass into this, to the end of the element that you're trying to refer to. In this case, it's the body. So I'll probably add this thing as ally. I'll add the ally that I've just created, which is this one over here, and save. So if I scroll down, I can see there's a new ally here, this one over here. Something here, okay? Obviously, it is empty right now because this we didn't do one step. Probably we should do ally.inner HTML, and I'll say maybe hello, hello world. Okay, so if you come back to here, you can see there's a hello world list going on here. Hello world list, right? And we can see that it's updated with all these things that we have, right? Including things like there's a class list, new ally, there's a class, new ally, content of hello world, right? And we basically added into your HTML document, okay? So the idea here is, first of all, you must, it's a sequence of steps. Whenever you're trying to change, make the modifications to elements, or you maybe want to add elements. So usually you have to select your element, elements, or create the element or elements, okay? So you have to select them or you want to create them, okay? And then after that, you make your changes via change their class list, maybe the inner HTML, maybe change the attributes, use whatever logic that you need. And at the end of them, if it's a new element, append child, you have to put it back onto your HTML. If it's not a new element, it means it's already there, so you don't have to do append child. All right, so it's just basically this sequence of steps whenever you are dealing with elements on the page, okay? So make sure you select your elements or you create them. If it's not there, then you change all the features, change your class list, inner HTML, change attribute. At the end of the step, if it's a new element, make sure you append child. If it's not a new element, that means it's already there. Then you just leave it and you don't touch it, okay? There's another step that you can, what you can do is you can also remove, right? You can delete them. So in the event you want to delete something, so let's say I want to delete this H1, this one over here. What I can do here is H1 dot remove, and that's it. H1 dot remove. By right, if I save this thing, I should not see a title anymore. You see, there's no title here. If I don't run this code, you see that I should have a title, but now if I try to remove this, there's no more title, okay? So here, maybe we have one last step maybe. If it's an existing element on the page, maybe you can choose to remove it, okay? All right, so yeah. Now the next section requires us to deal with forms, which I'll try to cover that in the next workshop, because the next workshop is where we are going to deal with servers. Okay, so I'll pair with the form section as well. How to change CSS of tag pictures. Okay, so there are multiple ways, but with the current level of knowledge, I highly recommend you to write the existing styles in your CSS. Let's say you have the CSS. Let's say you have maybe like, let's say class phase 1 like that, and then you have like color red, and then you have and then you have dot phase 2, and then you have your color green, something like that. Okay, so this is pretty common. You have phase 1, phase 2. Doesn't matter if let's say you already have an element with phase 1. HTML. Let's say this P over here. Class of phase 1. This P already has phase one. You see here, it's already on phase one. So what can you do with JavaScript? So let's say if JavaScript, you can make sure you select your P first. P is equals to human.query selector or P, and then P dot class list, okay, dot remove the phase one, and add phase two. You see here? So it is now green, okay? So notice how your phase one is no longer phase one, right? P is no longer phase one, it's phase two now, okay? Right. So I hope that answers your question, Erica. VS Code theme, Panda. Panda. So this one, Panda theme. Third session, our third session is tomorrow actually, same time. All right. So we'll end today's session. If there are no more questions, so yeah, I'll hand it back to Valerie.